Israeli official last night. That is why that particular road was taken out, the road from Lebanon into Syria, the major highway. Israel targeted that road yesterday, and we are told it was done because Israel sees that whether it's 3 days from now or 6 days from now, momentum toward a ceasefire is building, and they want to take out the routes through which Hezbollah could be resupplied. Richard.
John, the one thing that struck, let me take, as a final thought, let me take you in a completely different direction, if I may, this Sunday morning, as we have just been reporting the events in Qana and watching the Secretary of State. How aware is the State Department that just listening to Condoleezza Rice, she may have the logic of a long-term, sustainable ceasefire arrangement on her side, but you wanted to shake her and say, Mrs. Rice, while you're talking, people are dying. Civilians are dying. You may have the moral argument, but or you may have the legal argument, but the practicalities are against you. How aware is the State Department of that thought?
Oh, they understand that completely, and trust me, there are some within the State Department who would say, why don't we try a different approach here? What the United States is trying to say is, as we consider the moment, the tragedy, the horror of what happened in the past few hours, you have to also, because this is the troubled Middle East, consider the history as well. And what is the point, the State Department would say, of calling an end to the violence today if 3 days from now, 6 days from now, or 6 months from now, this can all start up again, and we will have another bombing of a building, whether it is in Israel or Lebanon or at some other outpost in the Middle East where women and children are killed as casualties, collateral damage, if you will, in a conflict. That is the State Department argument. They argue you have to have the historical long-term perspective, and they also acknowledge, Richard, it is a tough argument to make when you're seeing the pictures we're seeing today.
And there we'll leave you for the moment, John, to get back to your news-gathering duties. Our correspondent there, John King, who's in Jerusalem. Over the last hour, my word, you and I have been together for the last 70-odd minutes, and what a 70 minutes it has been. But we'll now rejoin Shihab Ratanzi in the CNN Centre, where our coverage continues. Good morning, Shihab.
Hi there, Richard. Yeah, let's get up to date now with recent events. A deadly Israeli attack in southern Lebanon triggering a political reaction from Beirut, and that's affecting the latest U.S. diplomatic efforts to find a long-term solution to the current Middle East crisis. Let's begin now with a statement by Lebanese Prime Minister Fouad Siniora.
Out of respect for the souls of our innocent martyrs and the remains of our children buried under the rubble of Qana, we scream out to our fellow Lebanese and to other Arab brethren and to the whole world to stand united in the face of the Israeli war criminals. The persistence of Israel in its heinous crimes against our civilians will not break the will of the Lebanese people. There is no place on this sad morning for any discussion other than an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, as well as the international investigation into the Israeli massacres in Lebanon now.
Now, Siniora's statement came after an Israeli airstrike killed at least 36 civilians in the southern Lebanese town of Qana. The deadly strike targeted a 4-story residential building used as a refugee shelter. Most of the dead are said to be children and women. Officials and rescue workers say they've been unable to reach dozens more trapped in the rubble of the bombed-out building. Outside of the official Lebanese government reaction to the Israeli strike in Qana, ordinary Lebanese citizens have also reacted angrily to the deadly raid. A group of demonstrators storming the UN headquarters in Beirut to register their anger, some hurling stones at the building and smashing windows with rocks and iron bars before forcing their way into the building. Michael Ware's been monitoring that demonstration. Michael, is that still going on?
Absolutely. The crowd is continuing to grow as more and more people dribble in, and their anger remains. One of the most important things that we're seeing here is that this potentially is the popular tide turning here in Beirut. People who'd been sitting on the sidelines, people who hadn't taken sides or strong points of view, seem to have come out in droves. We're seeing young, contemporary Christian youth chanting Hezbollah slogans. We're also seeing Hezbollah taking great advantage here and gaining the momentum. So far we've seen 2 Hezbollah deputies up on the bullhorns and on the PA, and they've been warmly received by all. The anger is directed not just at the UN, but also at the Israelis and, of course, the US.
What exactly, though, are Hezbollah officials saying about this latest attack? Are they giving any indication of what they might do in response?
No, at this stage, they're not throwing that far forward. What they're doing is responding to a popular outburst of anger and fervour. So what they're doing is they're capitalising and honing in on the people's outrage at what has happened in southern Lebanon. So they're talking about the Israeli Defence Force. They're talking about the nature of this as a religious conflict. And the most disturbing part is that everyone seems to be picking up on it, echoing it, at least in voice, if not in heart.
Now, the Lebanese Prime Minister calling for an immediate, unconditional ceasefire. We just heard Condoleezza Rice. It doesn't sound like he's going to get what he wants, if what Ms. Rice, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I could tell from what Condoleezza Rice was saying, that the Americans are sticking to their position.
Absolutely. It doesn't seem that they're ready to give an inch at this point. I mean, militarily, the objectives of the current operations are far from achieved. Hezbollah has not been crippled as the Israeli Defence Force intended. In fact, in public perception terms, certainly here in Lebanon, and it seems in the Arab street, Hezbollah has the momentum. This is not a moment where the IDF can afford to take a step back. Otherwise, they will appear as weak. So certainly the United States needs to back them in that, because the United States, for better or for worse, in public perception terms, has thrown their lot in with the Israeli Defence Force.
Michael Ware, thank you. Stand by, though. We'll go to Carl Penhall now. He's in southern Lebanon, where these latest, it looks like actually the demonstrators have just broken through the gate. Actually, maybe we should stick with Michael for a little while. The demonstrators appear to be broken through the compound. Michael, can you see what these same pictures that we're looking at? This is tape from earlier, I'm sorry. I thought these were live pictures from Beirut. Let's go then to southern Lebanon, where the bombing initially took place. Carl Penhall, perhaps you can bring us up to date with what exactly happened in the aftermath.
Shihab, according to the Lebanese Red Cross, they've so far pulled 25 bodies from the ruins of that four-story building that was targeted in Kana. They say that 8 people were wounded, but the most significantly, they say anything between 35 and 60 other people may be still beneath those ruins. Hard to believe, looking at some of the pictures of the rubble, that any of those would be alive. But what both the Red Cross and local residents say is that this building was being used, certainly the basement of it, by civilians who were sheltering from the effects of war. Now, in addition to this bomb that fell alongside this building in Kana overnight, in fact, that's what my colleague Ben Wiedemann, who was down there this morning, has told me, that the impact of the crater of the bomb is alongside the building. That caused the building to collapse. But in addition to that, the whole town of Kana, which isn't a very big town, was under bombardment throughout the night. Residents spoke that more than 80 shells and bombs, both from warplanes and artillery positions, fell on Kana, and that forced more and more people into the basements of buildings. And then this big bomb drops alongside this building, and the pictures that we've seen this morning are absolutely horrific. Just because of the horror of those pictures, we can't show them all on television, but I have seen mothers holding the bodies of dead babies. I've seen the pictures of husbands holding the bodies of dead wives. Very horrific pictures, Shihab.
Yeah, I suppose we should make clear, it's probably those pictures, those particularly graphic pictures that are being shown right now and are inflaming people in Lebanon and elsewhere right now. We're obviously not showing the most gruesome of the pictures, but they are terrible. Now, the IDF says that these people were warned to leave the area. How easy would that have been? Why might they not have left?
It certainly is true that the Israeli military have been bombarding this whole area with leaflets, the whole of southern Lebanon with leaflets, trying to separate the civilian population from Hezbollah. But there's a reality here. There's a reality that, first of all, a lot of these people are simply too afraid to take to the highways and byways to get out of danger's way, because we've seen civilian cars and civilian convoys repeatedly targeted. Najim Hospital, just a short distance from where I am now, is full of civilian casualties, most of whom say that they were hit when they tried to leave their villages, the outlying villages, to come to some kind of safety here in Tyre. We've seen civilian apartment buildings bombed here in Tyre. Now, there's another factor as well, in that fuel has run very short. A lot of the gas stations have been bombed, and so even those who have cars don't necessarily have the fuel to power those cars, so they just have to hunker down and try and stay out of harm's way, Shihab.
Were we able to gauge from the people at the scene, though, whether Hezbollah was indeed using the immediate area outside that building to launch rockets against Israel?
It's certainly very difficult to gauge from those pictures, and certainly nothing that my colleague Ben Wiedemann brought back that would indicate that Hezbollah had been using that specific position to fire off rockets. Of course, we do know that Hezbollah has been firing many rockets from this area of southern Lebanon, across southern Lebanon, not only Kana, but also the southern and eastern edges of Tyre as well. We've seen repeated barrages of rockets going up from here, but again, difficult to say precisely where those are, and then these strikes go in. The Israelis, of course, do accuse Hezbollah of using civilians as human shields. I personally haven't seen that, but certainly that accusation is out there, Shihab.
Thanks, Carl. Carl Penhall reporting from Tyre. Well, one Lebanese journalist with the Hezbollah-affiliated Al-Manar TV station says Israel's claims that Katyusha rockets were being fired from Kana are simply not true. But a spokesman for the Israeli military counters that those claims are based on facts.
This is a war zone. Why a village turned into a war zone? I suggest you ask Hezbollah. We don't want to be there. We don't want to be attacking villages or the areas around villages. But the fact is that Hezbollah has chosen this as their launching grounds for their attacks on us, intentionally endangering their civilians, because they know that something like this is liable to happen, and they do it wantonly. They shoot from civilian areas. And in this war, the world has to start to understand that people who use civilians as cover are responsible for the welfare of civilians, not the army that's trying to defend its civilians from missile attacks.
They have always been saying this to people. They target civilians everywhere, in the streets, in the bridges, in the airports, in the seaports, and they say, in that place you have a lot of valleys. You have a lot of valleys in that area that Hezbollah could have launched its attacks from any area in the valleys, not near the residential areas. All the journalists, all the reporters that went there, where they were very positive that there was no sign of military action from that area. This is what the Israelis use in order to justify their crimes, though they are not justifiable.
And before that strike on Kana, which resulted in those civilian casualties, we were covering a different element of the Israeli campaign. There was word that a significant operation and a ground offensive that was underway from northern Israel into southern Lebanon. Matthew Chance joins us now from the Lebanese-Israeli border. What of that, Matthew?
Well, that offensive is still very much underway, according to the Israeli military officials that we've been speaking to here on the Israeli-Lebanese border. What they're describing, as you mentioned, is a significant incursion into the Lebanese town of Taiba, which is described by the Israeli Defense Forces as a launching pad for Hezbollah rockets into Israel. They say they've been there since the early hours of this morning, Sunday local time. There have been fierce clashes with Hezbollah fighters on the ground, a number of injuries on the Israeli side. They say they've killed at least 3 Hezbollah fighters. They've also seized a number of caches of weapons, and despite this latest incident in Kana, the Israeli military say that they're going to continue to strike, even possibly to intensify their military operations in southern Lebanon over the course of this day, Shihab.
Is it your understanding, though, and let's face it, this isn't the first time that civilian casualties have been struck directly by, or indeed indirectly, as perhaps in Kana, because it was outside the building after all, but you know, missiles have been killing many civilians. Are any inquiries underway? After all, these aren't Katyusha rockets that the Israelis are using, they're precision-guided ammunition.
Well, that's right, and certainly there is a big mismatch between the kind of weaponry that a militia like Hezbollah is able to throw across the border into Israel and the kind of vast, powerful, accurate weapons that Israel has in control of. And so, yes, there is a great deal of concern, I imagine, behind closed doors. Officially, though, they're blaming Hezbollah for this, saying that they shouldn't have used Kana as a base from which to fire rockets into Israel. They say they'll defend Israeli citizens regardless of where these missiles are fired from. And so that is, at the moment, the Israeli position. Whether that will change, though, over the coming days, coming weeks, as this really starts to be considered by the Israeli people, so far there's been a great deal of support amongst ordinary Israelis for this conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, more than 80% according to latest opinion polls. But even at the beginning of this campaign, there was concern that it would take what was called then another Kana to take place, to turn the tide of public opinion. In 1996, that's a reference to during the Grapes of Wrath campaign, again against Hezbollah, when the Israeli Air Force bombed a UN compound in Kana, as we've been reporting, killing more than 100 people back then. That really turned the tide of public opinion against the Grapes of Wrath campaign, and there's concern that that may happen this time as well, although, to be honest, we haven't seen any sign of that yet, Shihab.
Do you get the sense, though, that while Israeli politicians talk ceasefire and multinational forces in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem with Condoleezza Rice there, the IDF still feels that they have a window to do as much damage as possible in southern Lebanon?
I certainly think there's a sense in which, as we approach this diplomatic phase, hopefully, of this conflict, and at least people now are talking about the possibility of a ceasefire on the horizon, there is a possibility that both sides will use this as an opportunity to inflict the heaviest blows that they can on the other side before they have to pull back under pressure from the international community. But what Israel says definitely is that they're in favor of a ceasefire, but they want a ceasefire that doesn't allow Hezbollah to rearm. And so they're looking at the international community, particularly at the United States, to try and put pressure on the Syrians, for instance, to try and prevent them from rearming Hezbollah should any ceasefire be held, or even a multinational force to not just police a buffer zone between Israel and Lebanon, but also to police the border, or to help the Lebanese army police the border between Syria and Lebanon, to try and intercept any arms shipments that may be attempted to be transferred from Syria to Hezbollah. And so that's the kind of ceasefire that Israel has said up until now it wants. But obviously the pressure is building as we see these immense civilian casualties for a ceasefire to come before any such agreement, any framework can be put in place.
Matthew Chance on the border between Israel and Lebanon. Let's return now to Richard, who has an update. Richard?
Shihab, the story this morning, of course, now developing on two fronts. We obviously have the events in Kana, where the dead and injured are still being removed from the rubble. Dozens of women and children are believed to have been killed. But separately to that, in Beirut, where there are protests outside and now probably inside the UN compound. Let's go to Beirut. Our correspondent, Brent Sadler, joins me from the Lebanese capital. Brent, what is happening with those protests?
Richard, in the past couple of hours there has been a gathering protest in the main Riyad al-Salah Square in downtown Beirut, primarily targeting the United Nations headquarters in the Lebanese capital. Several thousand people now assembled. Earlier when it was gathering, though, there was a violent backlash to the attack on Kana and the resultant heavy loss of life, many of them children. Protesters attacked the building with rocks and iron bars. This is a very heavily protected building in the center of Beirut. They stormed through security perimeters and established a presence right at the very front of the building, causing concern for United Nations staff trapped inside. However, within the past hour, the situation has certainly calmed. Lebanese security forces came in with heavy numbers, including some armored vehicles that are on the sidelines right now. And since then, we've been hearing a series of speakers, primarily those who would be sympathetic to Hezbollah's political and military campaign, speaking to the crowd, whipping up anti-Israeli, anti-US sentiment as the country and the Arab region at large digests the horrendous casualties that came about as a result of that Israeli air attack in southern Lebanon. Richard.
What has struck me about the pictures we are seeing this morning, Brent, is that a lot of the people are, if you like, ordinary men and women, children who would have been going about their normal business in Beirut and have come out to protest. This isn't the, if you like, the militant rent-a-mob that you often see at these sort of occasions.
Richard, this is a real mix of Lebanese. You've got people who've been displaced, made refugees here. You've got people who say they have lost family or relatives or friends in this conflict. They are part of this demonstration. You have certainly supporters of Hezbollah because they're carrying the Hezbollah yellow flag. You have other members of other Muslim leftist parties like the Socialist Syrian National Party. I've seen their flags in this crowd. You also have supporters of Michel Aoun, who is an important Christian leader in this country, but by no means does the Aounist camp represent all Christians. They support, in principle at least, Hezbollah have done politically over the past few months. You, however, are not seeing, in terms of bulk numbers, those who took part in the major Cedar Revolution demonstrations that led to the Syrian withdrawal more than a year ago. This is certainly an important cross-section of society, but by no means representative of all society. But you do have Lebanese cedar tree flags as part of this protest. They will be people who you could perhaps describe as showing more neutrality, neither with Hezbollah nor against Hezbollah, and certainly we'll have to see how the Lebanese media picks up on this in terms of the sentiment of this country, because the country has been divided over support for Hezbollah's military capability for quite some time, for years in fact, and whether or not the civilian loss of life and the high numbers of children killed in those Israeli airstrikes turns public opinion, makes it very difficult for those who would be anti-Hezbollah to maintain that rigid stance. Richard.
To the extent that the UN compound was merely a vehicle by which this protest could take place, that they could, if you like, just exhibit some form of anger against the situation, rather than, I mean, if you like, any building in a storm, Brent?
No, not really, Richard. Traditionally, protests have been aimed at a potent symbol of what many Lebanese will call United Nations impotency. We've often seen demonstrations outside this building, and the building has been put behind a security cordon for the past year or so, since the Syrians withdrew from this country. One of the roads is actually blocked off from there, so there's always been an expectation that the United Nations could become a part of protests. Also next door to this location is the Lebanese Prime Ministry, that now sealed off by Lebanese security forces. So this is often a stage, an escape valve, if you like, for Lebanese national protest to take place. But we have heard speakers calling for protesters to stage another anti-US Israeli protest outside the US Embassy, which is several miles from this location at Al-Qa. The US Embassy, very well protected by the Lebanese security forces, part of Lebanon, and the security cordon there is several hundred meters from the actual embassy compound, which is a vast complex. So we'll have to see whether or not this protest moves from here and is established outside, or at least as close as they can get to the to the US Embassy. Richard.
We'll leave it there. Brent Sadler, thank you.
Now, US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice continues her diplomatic efforts in Israel, attempting to broker a deal to end the fighting in Lebanon. Rice met with Israeli Foreign Minister Livni and Defense Minister Amir Peretz on Sunday following Saturday talks with Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. But Rice will not be going to Beirut after Lebanese Prime Minister Fouad Siniora said all talks on a resolution to the Middle East crisis are on hold because of the Israeli airstrike on Kana. Earlier, Lebanese President Emil Lahoud spoke with us about the decision not to meet with the US Secretary of State.
You expect now that we can welcome Mrs. Condoleezza Rice to come to Lebanon after this massacre? I don't think so. All I'm saying is that I hope that the U.S. population sees these massacres in the media, because if they see that, I don't think they will want their U.S. administration to be on one side with Israel 100%.
However, about 40 minutes ago in a press conference, Condoleezza Rice said that it was her decision not to go to Beirut because, as she said, her work was in Israel. John King now joins us. He's traveling with Condoleezza Rice. What is that work? It doesn't seem to be an immediate, unconditional ceasefire.
Well, Shihab, the United States has been on record consistently saying it does not think a immediate, unconditional ceasefire would serve any purpose, because under an unconditional ceasefire, you would not have dealt with what the United States, and even more importantly, what Israel says is the critical element of convincing Israel it can stop its military operations, and that is some sort of a deal that gets Hezbollah, if not disarmed, at least pulled back from the southern Lebanese border and agreeing to end the hostilities as well, and getting the quick insertion into Lebanon of an international stabilization force, as well as the deployment of the Lebanese army. So Secretary Rice saying the conditions are not in place yet for an immediate, unconditional ceasefire, although she says she will stay here in Israel trying to bring that about. Let's listen to a bit of what Secretary Rice said about the tragic events today in Lebanon. And as we toss to the sound, let's also note that she was in a meeting with the Israeli defense minister when they interrupted that meeting and told her of the tragedy in Kana.
Of this tragic loss of life as I was meeting with the Israeli defense minister this morning. And once again, I was reiterating our strong concern about the impact of Israeli military operations on innocent civilians during crisis. We are working very hard to try to stop the violence. Too many innocent people, Lebanese and Israeli, have suffered. Too many people have lost their lives. Too many families are homeless. And too many children have been killed, injured, or are living in fear for their lives. The circumstances are very difficult, and emotions are understandably running high on all sides. I just spoke by telephone with Prime Minister Senior and conveyed my condolences personally to him, to the people of Lebanon. In the wake of the tragedy of the people and the government of Lebanon are dealing with today, I've decided to postpone my discussions in Beirut. In any case, my work today is here. I will continue to meet with Israeli officials as we work to put in place the elements necessary to bring an end to this conflict. We're making real progress on a political framework and believe the parties are coming together on this aspect. We are also pushing for an urgent end to the current hostilities, but the views of the parties on how to achieve this are different. The work we do here will make it possible for the United Nations Security Council to take decisive action for a ceasefire as soon as possible. Now I'm
Perhaps most significant in what the U.S. Secretary of State said there was the quote, "My work remains here." U.S. officials are saying they are in these very intense and very intricate negotiations with Israelis about the language of the UN Security Council that the United States believes could bring about a ceasefire. Obviously, that diplomacy complicated by the tragic events today and the horrible pictures that are inflaming tensions not only in Lebanon, but on the Arab street throughout this part of the world and across the world for that matter. Secretary Rice saying she will stay here to continue that work. We're actually told, Shihab, behind the scenes that the United States officials believe they are actually making significant progress toward the language of that resolution. So you have sort of a dichotomy today. You have these horrible emotional pictures on television and the Secretary of State in these private meetings with the lawyers going over the language of a Security Council resolution that Israel would accept. The big hang-up, we are told, is Israel is concerned about the rules of engagement for the new international force. What would happen if Iran or Syria tried to rearm Hezbollah once a ceasefire is struck? They are trying to come up with legal mechanisms to deal with the Israeli concerns in those private meetings. Secretary Rice saying she would speak to Prime Minister Olmert here in Israel after an Israeli cabinet meeting today. She is, at least for now, staying here in Israel tonight to continue these negotiations. But all of this in flux, of course, already very sensitive diplomacy, complicated quite significantly by this tragedy today in Lebanon. Shihab?
As far as those discussions go, they did seem that Mark Regev of the Foreign Ministry on Saturday was suggesting that Israel was no longer going to demand that Hezbollah be disarmed, just moved behind the Litani River, and indeed there have been reports that Ehud Olmert might consider some resolution of the Sheba Farms issue, which Israel still occupies in contravention of a UN Security Council resolution. So, I mean, could you say, though, that Israel was beginning to soften its position as far as this long-term solution is concerned?
We had strong indications from both U.S. and Israeli sources that there were no significant hang-ups to the concessions, assurances, call them what you will, that the United States was seeking as part of the grand deal, if you will. And one of those was indeed Sheba Farms. And we've been told by a number of sources on the Israeli side and the U.S. side that right now Israel's position is that the United Nations has said Sheba Farms belongs to Syria, that it is part or an extension of the Golan Heights, and that Israel is telling the United States if Syria would say it belongs to Lebanon or if the United Nations would say it belongs to Lebanon, that Israel has no objection to making it part of a deal so long as the other items of the deal are acceptable to Israel. And this is where you get into this very intricate, very obscure legal language. Which chapter of the UN rules would the resolution be passed under? If it is passed under Chapter 7, and we're getting arcane here, that then would prohibit all members from violating it. And the Israelis want that because they want it on the record, that if they see a rocket shipment coming through Syria to Hezbollah, that they can attack that rocket shipment. And so that is the sort of the back and forth they are in among the lawyers right now. But on the big picture, U.S. officials and Israeli sources are telling us that there is no huge hang-up, so long as the international force has the robust mandate that Israel thinks will be necessary to enforce any ceasefire, because, plain and simple, Israel simply does not trust Hezbollah to honor any ceasefire.
For much of the world, though, I mean, it's often expressed in a lot of newspapers and so on that Condoleezza Rice simply isn't an honest broker, because on the one hand, of course, she's talking peace. On the other hand, the U.S. is expediting delivery of bombs which result, of course, in the sort of incidents that we saw just today in Qana. How aware, how much do they care, really, in the State Department about this lack of credibility in much of the world right now?
It is a growing lack of credibility, or a credibility challenge, at least. U.S. officials insist that they should have credibility. They insist they are working as hard as possible. You just heard it from the Secretary of State. But they also understand that whether it's perception or reality, especially on the Arab and Muslim street, the United States is not viewed as an honest broker. Now, the United States says that it won't acknowledge publicly, Shihab, that it is giving those more sophisticated weapons to Israel, but privately our sources confirm that is happening, and the United States' position is that those weapons are more reliable in terms of targeting, and that they will help Israel reduce the likelihood of tragic events like today, of civilians being hit in the bombing, and they will hopefully bring about a quicker resolution. But there is no question that that explanation just simply flies into the face of this very harsh perception here in the Arab world and in the Muslim world that the United States is not an even broker, an honest broker, that it is lopsided in favor of Israel. And consider it, we are talking about this in the immediate concern about trying to bring about a ceasefire. Remember what President Bush and Prime Minister Blair said just the other day. They are hoping out of this tragedy to get to some of the bigger issues in the Middle East, to get the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, to revive that, to perhaps get to Syria and Israel talking again down the road. Some say that's simply ludicrous, given the fact that the United States has limited credibility right now, and that tensions, mistrust of Israel, all of this is boiling and boiling and boiling once again here in the region. Shihab.
John King reporting. Thanks, John.
The events of this morning all began, of course, when there was that attack, the Israeli airstrike that killed dozens of civilians in Qana in southern Lebanon. We're joined now by Carl Penhall, who's in Tag. Carl, do we as yet know a final death toll and a final number of injured from the attack?
No, we've still got no final death toll from that. The latest we have from the Lebanese Red Cross is that at least 25 people have been killed. Those bodies have been extracted now from the rubble. 8 also being in hospital receiving treatment for wounds that they received when that bomb fell next to this 4-story apartment building. But the big question mark still is how many people were sheltering in that building and in the basement of that building. Local residents have told the Red Cross that anything between 35 and 60 people were using that place as a shelter, trying to stay out of an intense aerial bombardment that was directed at Qana over the course of the night. By some accounts, 80 bombs and shells falling in and around that town, Richard.
There is a dispute, and perhaps it will never be fully clarified, whether that building or a building nearby was being used by Hezbollah. It seems to be one of those questions that we may never know the full answer on.
Certainly the to and fro there. We have heard this morning the accusations by the Israeli military that Hezbollah militia fighters were using an area near that building as a rocket firing position, or maybe possibly even the building itself. We've heard on the Hezbollah-sponsored Al-Manar TV station that that claim has been stringently denied. From what we have seen on the ground, my colleague Ben Wiedemann was down there, and all that we see from the pictures is the rubble of a house, and the bodies that are being brought out seem to be civilians. No indication that there was weaponry being brought out of the rubble there, or these people were fighters. We've seen some very gruesome pictures there this morning of the bodies of children being held up by their mothers and the bodies of women being held up by their husbands, Richard.
Carl, the Israelis said, and speaking
going into the Arab town of Al-Adisa, which is sort of a little bit this way, with ground forces, the elite Nahal brigade going in there, trying to clear out Hezbollah positions, which they say Hezbollah has been using to fire Katyusha rockets into Kiryat Shimona. Metula, up until now, has remained relatively untouched by Katyusha rockets. There's a couple that fell into an open area, but today, for the first time, Katyusha rockets fell inside the perimeter of the town. We counted 3 of them. One landed about 200 yards away from where we were. You hear that sort of, it's kind of a hissing sound that lasts for about a second and a half. It just tells you something is coming in, followed immediately by that explosion. One hit harmlessly on a hillside, another buried itself in a street, caused a fire, and took out a vehicle. But as far as we know, there have been no injuries today. But it would seem to indicate that as Israel starts to push into new Hezbollah territory, Hezbollah is determined to fight back, Tony.
Okay. And John, I think another important point to make here is that even as we do the reporting that we are on the situation in Kana, Lebanon, the Israeli Defense Forces are continuing to push forward with their offensive. John Roberts for us in northern Israel. John, we appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, our breaking news coverage on the latest developments in the Middle East crisis does continue. Stay with us. We're going to take a short break, but CNN is your most trusted name in news. We'll be right back.
Very close to a very big city in Israel. A few minutes ago, this city has been attacked by Hezbollah military guys here in this area. We have to fight them and we have to engage them where they are. I mean, in some villages, in some cities, they are using villages and cities as outposts, as military bases against Israel. It is a war against terrorism, a war imposed on Israel, and we have to fight and to win.
But are the troops staying in these villages, or are these brief incursions and then they withdraw? Or is there an effort underway to hold these villages until there's a ceasefire or an international peacekeeping force?
No, our policy is to fight, to complete the mission, and then to move to another point. We have no objective, no intention to stay in Lebanon. We have been there before. We know what is Lebanon. We don't want to be here. But we have to fight, and we have to destroy this Islamic terror from Hezbollah organization.
And my last question to you. I saw for myself yesterday through binoculars from a vantage point along the border the Hezbollah flag flying. The Israeli defense minister has said that flag will no longer fly along the border when this Israeli military operation is complete. Are those Hezbollah flags still flying as best you know? And when do you expect for the Hezbollah to be cleaned out of southern Lebanon?
Flag can stay, but Hezbollah soldiers or militants or terror whatsoever will not be here.
And how long will that take?
It will take the time that is needed to do it. But the state of Israel facing terror from Islamic fundamentalism, we will win. It will take time, some time. We are patient. You know, we are the people of the book.
Lieutenant Colonel Lefovich, thank you for joining us. I appreciate it. And as you have heard, guys, this is still a conflict that has no end in sight. This despite the fact that diplomatic efforts here are struggling to resume, but for the moment at least have hit at least a serious bump in the road. Back to you.
All right, and David Lee, we should point out here that Lebanon's Prime Minister has now asked UN Chief Kofi Annan to hold an emergency Security Council meeting to arrange for immediate ceasefire after the Kana strike. So, of course, the UN was going to be discussing this tomorrow. Now the Lebanese Prime Minister asking for an emergency meeting. We'll have to pay close attention to see if, in fact, that comes together today or not.
But his interview was so interesting because you could hear the frustration in that Israeli official's words that they're being depicted as the bad guys because anytime children are killed, obviously there's international outrage, and he's saying Hezbollah chose that Hezbollah was using them as human shields, and when we're doing the best that we can, we're under attack.
Very difficult situation indeed for Israel, and as we pointed out, this is an asymmetrical war. It is a war against terrorism, and that Lieutenant Colonel basically saying, we are patient, we will continue to fight this until they crush Hezbollah. We are people of the book, an obvious reference to the Bible. And of course, this is something that we continue to watch, and many of us thought that it would have been over, but we are in day 19 now, the Middle East conflict.
And everything seems to be escalating on this day. Breaking news as it happens right here on Fox and Friends Weekend. Stay with us.
Announcing the Subaru all-wheel deal model year clearance. There's never been a better time to buy the Subaru Outback and Forester. Right now, get an Outback 2.5i with amazing 0% APR financing and $2,000 cash back. The all-wheel drive Outback and Forester. Both are great alternatives to gas-guzzling SUVs, and they have a 5-star crash test rating.
Every day is a winding road.
Hurry with 0% financing and $2,000 cash back. Supplies won't last.
You see your business, we see your potential. We all have a big picture. What's yours? Regions, that's the power of everyday confidence.
I've been to Newark, Hackensack, 3 meetings back-to-back.
Conference in Maine, put faces to names.
Seminar, Lombard, big stack of business cards.
Date at Comfort Suites, got a hot breakfast free.
Warehouse inventory. Portman had a funny story.
Big meeting, New Rochelle, told my boss, all went well.
I've been everywhere, man. I've been everywhere.
To get 3 free nights at these Choice hotels, get the no annual fee Choice Privileges Visa credit card. For reservations and more details, visit choicehotels.com. Choice Hotels. We'll see you there.
It's back to school, and Best Buy's got what kids need to succeed, like laptops with fingerprint scanners for extra security, convertible notebooks that let you jot notes directly on the screen for new ways to learn, and media center computers that let you record, watch, and pause live TV. Check out the Gateway convertible notebook with dual-core technology. It's a perfect blend of performance and creativity. Save big for back to school, now at Best Buy.
And welcome back, everyone, to Fox and Friends Weekend. Of course, Kelly, so much breaking news happening today in the Mideast.
It's a very busy day, and a lot of people are concerned about it. We've been following all the developments as they're breaking as we speak, unfolding as we speak, as a matter of fact. There's just so much to report.
And we want to turn now to our next guest, who's going to talk to us about the fact that it was supposed to disarm Hezbollah. The United Nations, of course, is what we're talking about. It's done little, though, to prevent Hezbollah from trucking weapons into Lebanon.
And George Mason University School of Law professor Michael Krauss joins us now from our D.C. Bureau. Michael, welcome to Fox and Friends on this very busy morning. You've been watching all the developments as they unfold in the Middle East this morning. The president, or the prime minister, I should say, Prime Minister Sinora, asking for an immediate meeting of the UN Security Council. But has the UN failed the international community in dealing with this situation?
I think it's not only failed to deal with the situation, I think the UN has enabled this situation to happen. The UN has been an enabler for Hezbollah for about 25 years now.
And you mean by enabling the fact that they had peacekeepers on the ground since the late 70s, specifically along this region, the Lebanon-Israeli border, and allowed Hezbollah to continue to build tunnels, to build up their weaponry supplies, at least since 2000?
Yes, their peacekeepers had 3 missions according to UN Security Council resolutions. 1, to oversee Israeli withdrawal, 2, to ensure peace in the area, and 3, to make sure that the Lebanese government patrolled its own borders. They didn't have to do anything to ensure the Israeli withdrawal. Israel did this by themselves. They've done nothing for the other 2. They've stood and watched by as Lebanon has lost its sovereignty over the southern part of the country, and it's been taken over by Hezbollah.
So, Professor Krauss, where do you turn? Who do you turn to in order to broker some sort of sustainable peace, which, of course, the United States and Israel wants? They do not want to repeat what happened some 20 years ago.
Right. You cannot turn to the UN. In 1978, after the PLO shelled Israeli positions from southern Lebanon, Andrew Young, who was then the U.S. representative at the UN, recommended the UNIFIL forces. That has not worked. John Bolton is not Andrew Young. I think whatever happens, we can't have the UN. If we're going to have a multinational force, it's going to have to be a force that's willing to shoot and kill these Hezbollah fighters.
You know, what's interesting then is, of course, we had UN Resolution 1559 from 2004. That ultimately was never enforced. Now, of course, tomorrow the UN will be meeting again, potentially sooner. Condoleezza Rice is going to present her proposal to them as soon as Tuesday or Wednesday. So it looks like the UN is going to be involved once again. Is it simply because there's no other world body to turn to in order to organize all of these countries to come together? What is it?
Well, I'm not a fly on the wall, but I have to believe that Secretary of State Rice is going to formulate a plan that will allow Israel the time needed to sweep out Hezbollah, and at that point to allow international forces from countries that are willing to fire back, not merely to watch, to be present. And apparently NATO is unwilling to do the job, in part because of countries like France, but I can imagine a half-dozen countries whose forces, if they're in sufficient numbers, much greater than 2,000.
Who? What countries?
My goodness, I'm not a foreign affairs representative of any of these countries, but I would imagine countries like Australia, countries like Canada, several other countries whose forces would actually, if they're in sufficient numbers, would dissuade Hezbollah from setting up shop again. Don't forget that Hezbollah can now fire from Beirut. They don't need to be right at the Israeli border anymore.
All right. Professor Michael Krause, we thank you this morning for joining us. We got to run, but you've given us
artillery fire. And again this morning, there is all sorts of activity, and you can even see the smoke rising. Most of the town, we hope, we've heard most everyone has cleared out of there because it's such a hot spot. But yet, rockets continue to land there.
Yeah, these Katyusha rockets basically inflict a lot of terror, if you will, and damage. There's no rhyme or reason as to where they'll strike because they're not guided missiles. They fly on their own inertia. We're hearing a blast right there. All of this is unfolding today in an area where there's been a hotbed of activity today in the town of Kana, which is about 8 or 9 miles away from Tyre, Lebanon. Innocent people were killed following an Israeli attack. We should point out here, very important to point out here, that the Israeli Defense Forces had dropped leaflets warning the people they were going to strike because they were after a Hezbollah stronghold. The people apparently, for some inexplicable reason, did not leave but stayed there. It could be difficulty getting transportation. We're hearing another blast.
We're having a place
and
to
we're
go.
seeing the smoke there. But in Kiryat Shmona, some of the people in Kana may not have had a place to go, but the bottom line is 23 children among the dead.
And obviously that is not a good sign for the way that the rest of the world now will wake up this morning and look at the picture here in the Mideast. Most of the world had been aligned, at least with believing that Israel had the right to defend itself. Many countries were calling for a ceasefire as we entered day 19 of this struggle. Now, how will this change world perception? Earlier today, on the streets of Beirut, we saw live as it was unfolding a major protest where Lebanese people came carrying the Hezbollah flag, shouting anti-American sentiments and storming the UN building, which was ironic in and of itself, since the UN is supposedly the body that would be helping and bringing aid to these Lebanese people. At the same time now, crossing the wires as an urgent, we have the fact that the Lebanese Prime Minister Senori is asking for Kofi Annan, the UN Secretary General, to hold an emergency Security Council meeting today. The UN, of course, was going to take this up tomorrow, but he's asking for an emergency Security Council meeting today, and he's saying that 750 Lebanese people have been killed in this war, only 51 Israelis.
And Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice saying we are working hard to end the violence.
All right, we have so much more from our correspondents in the region and our guests. Stick around. Fox and Friends Weekend will be right back.
Everybody's looking for the
And good morning, everyone.
Good morning to you, too.
Good morning.
Good morning. It's been such a busy morning. We had a special edition of Fox and Friends Weekend because we started early because so much was happening in Beirut, Lebanon. That was the scene of a pretty vehement protest there in response to a very deadly day in the village of Kana, where we're now learning at least 50 civilians. The latest count is 54 civilians were killed by an Israeli rocket, many of them children. But Israel says that this was a Hezbollah stronghold, this was a base of operations, and that's why they struck in this village of Kana. So we are bringing you all of the reaction to that, and our correspondents are very, very close to all of these hot spots. And in fact, Greg Palcott was one who was able to go to the village of Kana and perhaps the first reporter on the scene, get all of the aftermath and watch all of it.
And we should mention, coming up in the next hour of Fox and Friends Weekend, we want you to really watch this. We're going to have Ehud Barak, who of course is the former Prime Minister of Israel. He'll be here to give us his information about what's unfolding in the region. And obviously he will have a lot to say and talk about this recent series of attacks, attacks on Israel, attacks on Kana and other areas of Lebanon. But right now we have Greg Burke, who is in the region. He's in Beirut, Lebanon, where that crowd of protesters were there earlier, but now we understand that they have dispersed or dissipated.
It has broken up, and that is the good news, because I tell you, a couple hours ago, maybe an hour and a half ago, when they were in front of the UN building, things really looked rough for a time, and there was a lot of breakage going on there as they basically stormed the UN building. I was just talking with our cameraman. I was on the outside of that demonstration, outside the building, but I was just talking with our cameraman who went inside. You'll see his shots later. He told me that actually it did not break up until one of the Islamic leaders, a sheikh, went in and told people to cool it, and they walked out and then did their chanting outside. But for a while there, 20 minutes or a half hour, all concentrated at the UN, basically a lot of broken glass. They went in, ransacked some offices, basically trashed what they could of the building. A lot of anger here, all springing, of course, from the attack and people having seen those images in the morning on television of what happened down in Kana and just really reached overflow. It was a demonstration that started pretty peacefully near the Parliament building with just a couple hundred people, but then rapidly moved around the corner to the UN building. And part of that is just because the UN will get you attention, and part of it is because people do expect more from the UN as well. Although the major targets of this demonstration, both talking to people and seeing the signs they were carrying, the major targets, the United States and Israel. Israel first, basically people saying, equating Israelis with terrorists because of this attack, complaints with the U.S. For their financial support of Israel. And then on the positive side, basically a lot of people were out there chanting in favor of Hezbollah, chanting in favor of the Hezbollah leader, Sheikh Nasrallah. That's the latest from here, guys. Back to you.
All right, Greg Burke, for us, obviously, the people there maybe don't necessarily know that the U.S. isn't on the greatest terms with the UN, so they're storming the UN building in protest, which I find ironic this morning. Our Greg Palcott, though, went to the scene of the Kana airstrikes this morning, and he joins us now live from Tyre. And, Greg, it's just crossing the wires that as many as 54 people were killed in this attack.
Gresham, Allison, Kelly, that's right. That seemed to jive with just about what we saw on the ground. Let's just give you some observational stuff first, and then we'll get into the blame game second. We were there as children, as women were pulled out, sometimes 2 children on top of a stretcher, an ugly, ugly scene. They were sheltering in the basement of a 3- or 4-story building when it collapsed on top of them at 1 a.m., when at least 1 Israeli bomb, maybe 2, maybe 3 hit around that site. It took another 4 or 5 hours for rescue crews to get there, so there was a desperate scene while people tried to fight for life, and then as the rescue teams came in there, tried to pull anybody alive out of the rubble. Mostly they were pulling dead people out of the rubble. Here, take a look a little bit of what I saw when I was down there at the scene at Kana just a few hours ago.
This is one of the craters created by the Israeli airstrikes overnight here in this town of Kana. As you can see, a mammoth crater and mammoth damage to the private residence just right next door to it. We were talking to people who were here overnight when this blast happened. They were huddled underneath here. If you can see underneath, it appears to be a kind of a basement shelter, and that's where many were in the house. The word we're getting is that dozens were inside, dozens dead, injured, men, women, and children. We've been talking to the Israeli Defense Force, and they tell us that this area, in fact, was used by the Hezbollah militia to fire Katyusha rockets from, and they told the folks here in this area to get out. But, in fact, for the people who are living in this area and have been watching all morning as their relatives and friends are pulled out by stretchers from this rubble, that is very, very little consolation. And the hunt continues now inside that building and others for any other people left.
In fact, Israeli Defense Force flatly saying that this is an area where Katyusha rockets were being fired from. We talked to our own security experts, and they say absolutely that area could very well be an excellent place to shoot the rockets into Israel. The Hezbollah militia, obviously, around there. Israeli Air Force been targeting a lot of sites all over that area as we drove through it. At the same time, there were children hurt, there were children killed, there were women killed, there were women hurt. Why were they there? Were they human shields? Were they thinking that they were safe in this shelter? We talked to some who said that they didn't get the word. We talked to some who said they did get the word, couldn't get through on the roads that were blocked or the roads that were too dangerous because of the Israeli Air Force overhead. A very complicated, ugly scene. We are left, though, with a very, very dreadful death toll and something that diplomats, politicians, and military strategists are dealing with at this moment. And the families in the town of Kana, they're dealing with it too. Back to you guys.
Yeah, Greg, it is dreadful, as you mentioned, and we did hear from an interview with David Lee Miller, who interviewed a lieutenant colonel from the region, that he believed that these people were basically used as human shields.
It could be that. That could be a reason. We've even heard that Katyusha rockets are stored in the basements of these houses alongside the people who are huddling there. That could very well be the case. In fact, many people have left the area. Most of these villages are ghost towns. They have taken the advice of the Israeli Defense Force and left. still, however, you do have these dead bodies. You have these children who are dead, these women who are dead, and it's a huge, huge political headache for Israel, and certainly a crusading call, not just for the Hezbollah militia, but for the Lebanese government, who have taken this up as one more reason to stop immediately the fighting for at least humanitarian reasons, guys.
And that is where we are right now.
Yeah, and Greg, some of our emailers are writing in and they're saying that perhaps these women and children were connected somehow to Hezbollah militants, that perhaps that's why they didn't leave. Can you speak to that?
Sure, that could be, that's a very valid theory. What we're seeing when we go to houses like this, when we go to shelters in the area, we're seeing a lot of women, a lot of children, a lot of elderly men and women. We're seeing almost no fighting age, I repeat, no fighting age men. Well, where are they, we ask? Oh, they're tending other houses, tending other properties. Well, they could be further south towards the border, tending Katyusha rocket launching pads, tending RPGs and anti-armor rockets. They could be fighting the good fight. So these could be the families of Hezbollah fighters, and they could be suffering in the middle of this battle. But again, that's just one more theory, one more possibility, guys.
All right, Greg Pelcott, thanks very much. That's an extremely interesting point, isn't it, that he doesn't find men of fighting age at these locations. I guess the bigger issue here is how the world's going to respond to this, because some of the Arab nations were being moderate, and in the beginning even showing some support for Israel defending itself, and now one has to wonder how this will enrage the Arab base in some of these countries, where the civilians who lived in these Arab countries were already upset at the leaders for showing any support for Israel. Now, how will the tide turn as far as the world picture is concerned?
And in terms of how the world leaders are responding, Steve Santani may have some insight into that. He is live in Jerusalem. He was following Condoleezza Rice's trip there, which now she will not be speaking to the Lebanese Prime Minister. What's the latest, Steve?
Well, she may be speaking to him, but she's not traveling to Beirut as apparently was planned. They mutually called off that visit. Meantime, Prime Minister Fuad Senora calling for an immediate ceasefire, calling for a UN Security Council emergency meeting to talk about Qana, where more than 50 people were killed, many of them children, just today. He says altogether 750 Lebanese people have been killed since this violence began about 3 weeks ago. Now, things were not easy for Secretary Rice here in the first place. They've gotten harder now with increasing calls and mounting pressure from the international community for an immediate ceasefire, but the Secretary sticking by her guns. She wants a conditional ceasefire. There have to be certain conditions in place first. The Secretary consulted today with some Israeli officials, both the Foreign Minister and the Defense Minister. She says she was meeting with Defense Minister Amir Peretz when she heard the news of the attack in Qana. She later told reporters she's deeply saddened by the civilian deaths there and that she wants a ceasefire as soon as possible. But both the U.S. and Israel are still insisting there be no ceasefire until certain conditions are met. Rice says there should not be a return to the status quo in Lebanon.
We are working very hard to try to stop the violence. Too many innocent people.
Attack. So here we have it. We'll be right back.
In the past 19 days, due to the fact that it has been a hot target, if you will, among Hezbollah factions who have continually lobbed or launched these rockets that fly on their own inertia without any guidance. They just hit randomly. It's hard to run and hide, even though many people in the area have their own bomb shelters. But you know, perhaps as we're seeing this, a lot of people are out of that region. It looks like it's hitting some areas that are not even occupied.
And at the same time, we've been talking all morning about the attack on the other side of the border in Lebanon, in the town of Qana, where as many as 54 people have died. Some reports say 23 to 37 of those are children. And of course, they were warned by leaflets put out by the Israeli forces, but those people did not get out of the building for whatever reason. We want to go live now to David Lee Miller, who is along the Israeli-Lebanese border. David?
Good morning. It is not only a very windy day here, as you can see, but we are also being subjected to a great deal of shelling. You can hear shelling being fired that's outgoing, Israeli shelling, and a short time ago there were a number of Hezbollah rockets fired in our direction here along the Lebanese-Israeli border. And seconds before we went on the air, there was a public address system. There are speakers throughout the entire region announcing that, in fact, we are possibly under risk now of being hit by a Katyusha rocket. So far today, about 100 of them have hit northern Israel. I'm not going to disclose the location of this one for security reasons to comply with Israeli censorship. We're going to, as you've seen us do before, conceal the exact location by putting our hand over the camera here so you can't see it relative to where I'm standing and broadcasting from. But there was a very loud blast a short time ago here along the northern Israeli border with Lebanon, and you can see still the brush smoldering. Some of the Israeli military officials we talked with believe that this was perhaps a larger Katyusha rocket than usual. The blast, as I said, was extremely loud. There was also a very big brush fire, much larger than the type of fires we have seen here. So this suggests the possibility, at least, that they are using another type of Katyusha. That is still not entirely clear. What I can tell you also today is that of the 100 or so hits that have landed in northern Israel, 4 people have been injured. We understand that there was one direct hit at a home. One of the people at that home, one person there, was hurt. None of these injuries, though, are thought to be very serious. And in the last 24 hours, as the shelling and the rocket fire continues here on the ground, Israeli forces moved into at least 3 Lebanese villages just over the border. The IDF saying that this is part of an ongoing operation. What they want to do is move in there with tanks, APCs, bulldozers, and have these brief incursions to clean out the Hezbollah. We understand from talking to the IDF that in some of these villages the IDF has already left, but they say that in many instances they will return to these villages if in fact they are required to do so. And lastly, on the subject of what happened in Lebanon this morning in Qana, Israeli officials from the Prime Minister on down are saying simply that the reason that this particular area was targeted is because Hezbollah militants were firing rockets from that particular location. They believe that there were launchers nearby. Civilians, they say, were warned to leave their homes, and they say that civilians were never targeted. The Israeli officials saying that the civilian deaths are the responsibility of Hezbollah because they were basically using them as human shields. And lastly, the Prime Minister here, Ehud Olmert, saying today that he is not in any hurry to reach a ceasefire. He says that Israel has to first achieve all its goals, and among those goals, the eradication of Hezbollah along the border. Back to you.
And David Lee, what does the public address system say when it warns you that there's an incoming Katyusha rocket? Does it tell you what to do?
Well, it's a warning in Hebrew, and basically to take cover. Many people, in fact everyone here, has a bomb shelter in their home. There are bomb shelters throughout the city. Every home has a secure area. And is that an incoming? Is that, I think off in the distance here, I think that's the remnant of a Katyusha rocket that you can see. My photographer is pointing it out to me. But people here know only too well what to do. And I have to add that, unfortunately, we normally get these warnings only after the rockets have hit. There is a little bit of a time lag. We're very close to the border here, and there's not a lot of time to notify people that a rocket is en route, unlike Haifa, where they have a good 2 or 3 minutes. Here, that is simply not the case. Back to you.
All right, David Lee, we thank you for that report and ask that you stay safe.
Wow. So it happens after the fact. That's not terribly helpful. But
it does.
In just 2 to 3 minutes. But I didn't know that everybody, he may have mentioned this, but I didn't know that everybody had a bomb shelter and that they can take cover.
Yeah, they
sort of
do.
They
have a communal bomb shelter that they go to, and you have within, David Lee mentioned in one of his early reports last week, you have about a minute to get there once you hear this siren. And as he mentioned, because Kiryat Shmona is so close to the border, those incoming rockets happen a lot quicker than they would Haifa.
Right.
So it's a situation that we continue to watch, and we talk about what's going on in Qana with some at least 54 civilians being killed there. But the fact remains that Israel is also under attack, so you have this tit-for-tat, tactically, if you will. And the solution, of course, is to try to find a way to bring a cessation to the violence and a stabilizing force in there to keep the peace.
Well, the interesting thing is, what kind of force will that be? Because the UN peacekeepers have not done the job. Will it be NATO now? It doesn't appear that it will be. What countries will step up to the plate and say, hey, yeah, we're willing to send our troops there, and we're willing to fire back at Hezbollah too? Because that will be the difference in the kind of troops that they send now as opposed to UN troops, which are only peacekeepers that would not fire back at Hezbollah. The U.S. forces, they don't want to be in this mix.
No, because it takes them back to 1983 when Marines went there to try to actually broker the peace, or maintain the peace, I should say. They were part of a multinational force back then, along with France, soldiers from the UK, as well as other troops from other parts of the country. Well, what happened in 1982, Hezbollah basically started, and what we understand is that Hezbollah got orders from Syria and Iran to take out, or to at least start taking out some of the U.S. Marines, as well as the French even at that time. And of course, the result of that was the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing, where we saw some 240 plus Marines die as a result of that terrorist attack. President Ronald Reagan at the time basically stating, this is a new war. This is a war involving terrorists. At that time, he wanted to take action. We did not. We didn't retaliate, and we didn't retaliate on some other issues, which leads to people like Osama bin Laden and Iran and Syria and Hezbollah stating that if the United States continues to get attacked, we will not retaliate. President George Bush basically stating now, that has changed. Yeah. We are in a war against terror. We will not cut and run. We will stay until the job is done, and that means defeating the enemy wherever they might be.
Meanwhile, all sorts of international leaders have weighed in on what happened this morning in Qana, where 54 people were killed, some of them women and children. The Lebanese Prime Minister has weighed in with a particularly strong response, and Rudy Bakhtiar is live talking about that. What's going on, Rudy?
Well, a lot is going on there today, guys. The Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice says she's deeply saddened by the terrible
news. She had called him up, Mr. Senor, she'd like to postpone the meeting, so it was obviously a mutual agreement that this is not the best time for them to get together in Beirut, and they probably won't be getting together at all in light of that huge Israeli airstrike that killed over 50 civilians, many of them children, today in southern Lebanon. Secretary Rice did tell reporters she's deeply saddened by the terrible loss of life today in Lebanon, and she says she's pushing for an urgent end to the fighting, but that's still not the same as an immediate ceasefire. Now, the Secretary was meeting this morning with the Israeli Defense Minister, Amir Peretz, when she heard about the attack in Qana in Lebanon. She later told reporters this kind of warfare is extremely difficult and it unfortunately has awful consequences sometimes. She made her strongest call yet for an end to the fighting, but continued to resist mounting international pressure for an immediate ceasefire, repeating her insistence that certain conditions need to be met first.
That's not good. I think what it's time to do is to get to a ceasefire. We actually have to try and put one in place. I've made the point, I made the point in Rome, that we want a ceasefire as soon as possible. I would have wanted to have a ceasefire yesterday.
Now, the Secretary met last night with Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert at his home here in Jerusalem. But the question remains, when and where will the Secretary meet Lebanese Prime Minister Fouad Siniora? Siniora, who met with Rice last week in Beirut, canceled a meeting that was set for today because of the airstrike in Qana. Siniora is among those demanding an immediate ceasefire. He also wants an emergency session of the UN Security Council to deal with the civilian deaths just today in Qana. Rice continues to work for a UN ceasefire resolution that lays out conditions for what she hopes would be a more lasting peace. The U.S. and Israel believe that if there was an immediate unconditional ceasefire, that would simply allow Hezbollah the time to regroup and rearm. Back to you guys in New York.
Steve, I'm interested in getting your point of view on this, because it seemed up until about 12 to 14 hours ago that momentum was building towards Secretary Rice coming to some sort of an agreement with these parties. Then we had this situation in Qana. Does this just throw everything out the window, or is she just plodding along as she was?
Well, certainly it's an unexpected challenge and a difficult challenge for the Secretary. She didn't expect to be met with this kind of violence in Lebanon, where so many civilians are killed. That obviously puts a damper on things, makes it more difficult for her. But she did say that she believes progress is being made on the political front, so that in spite of this, the two sides are getting closer together on what she thinks they need to do to lay out a lasting peace, a conditional peace plan that does call for the disarming of Hezbollah, that international peacekeeping force being put in place, and for those 2 kidnapped Israeli soldiers to be returned unharmed. So that's what she's working for. She continues to keep her eye on the ball, so to speak, hoping that there will be a UN resolution as early as Wednesday calling for a ceasefire that will have some of those or all of those elements in place. And she believes there's been progress on that front, but certainly there's been a change of plans. She's not being able to meet with Senora today as expected, as planned. And from here, it might be a little bit more of a bumpy road.
Yeah, Steve, we understand that she's going to remain focused, and of course diplomacy in and of itself is very tedious. But one has to raise the question, did Hezbollah calculate this, or is Hezbollah just taking advantage of this strike on Qana?
Well, did they calculate it? Well, certainly, we know that they've been mixing their missiles in with civilians in civilian housing in southern Lebanon. That makes it very difficult for there to be an airstrike at all, for Israel to go after Hezbollah without also causing some occasional civilian casualties. And in this case, the casualties were very high, 50 or more, including some 23 children. So certainly they're at war, and they use all the tools at their disposal, be they public relations or strategic or military.
Steve, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but so one could surmise from this that perhaps Hezbollah has always intended to undermine the efforts of Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice.
Well, probably so, because they certainly don't see eye to eye with Secretary Rice, who sees eye to eye with Israel. They are vehemently opposed to any kind of conditions being met. They are not unopposed to a ceasefire, an unconditional ceasefire, but as I've said, the U.S. and Israel just believe that would give Hezbollah the advantage and some time to get some new weapons shipped in, regroup, and reorganize, and to go back at it again. And the U.S. and Israel don't believe Hezbollah would stick by any kind of a immediate unconditional ceasefire arrangement.
And Steve, now that Condoleezza Rice and the Prime Minister, Senora, will not be meeting today, has the Secretary of State's office released a schedule or a statement of what will fill the void and where she goes from here now?
No, that's sort of an unanswered question as well. You know, they don't usually put out a detailed schedule anyway because of security concerns. They don't want us to know when she's going to be meeting who, where. There was no official meeting on the schedule for Beirut with Senora, but apparently they were planning to meet because Senora called and said, don't come. This is not a good time. I don't want you here right now. The secretary tells it differently. She said she called up and said, well, can we postpone this? So it's a little hard to tell what happens from here. She will certainly be on the phone again with Ehud Olmert, may meet again with Ehud Olmert, may fly back to the States on Monday to get ready for the action at the UN, where she hopes this whole thing will shift and where she hopes there can be some kind of resolution.
All right. Steve Centani, thank you so much, Steve.
Well, I mean, obviously it would be unfortunate if this just goes away, and if she never is able to meet with the Lebanese leadership now, and she comes back to this United Nations Security Council meeting without any communication with them. I mean, other than this phone call. That she
you know, it's quite a quandary that she's been placed in now. And of course, what Steve said that was so encouraging is the fact that Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice remains focused on the task at hand. So what is that task? That you broker a cessation of violence according to Chapter 7, and that you get a multinational force in there. And then the question is, will Hezbollah disarm?
She said in her comments when she said she was not going to be meeting with the Prime Minister of Lebanon, she said that she had much work to be done still here. So one would assume that she was going to stay in the region, maybe hoping that she could eventually see the Prime Minister in Lebanon, maybe to continue talks with the Israelis. What this does, though, for the world picture, though, is that it keeps showing the pictures of her talking to Israel.
Right.
And even though it was the Prime Minister of Lebanon who says, hey, don't come up here, the world picture is still going to look like she continues to side with Israel, and that could be problematic.
And we will find out later this week, of course, when she arrives back in the United States to go before the UN. We understand that she might be getting there as early as Wednesday, and of course Monday, the UN Security Council is supposed to start talking about what to do about this Israel-Lebanon conflict. And don't forget about Hamas to the south. That would include the Palestinians. But we've got a whole lot of news going on today as well.
And I understand that it's just just coming across the wires, Kelly, that Condoleezza Rice will be back in the U.S. on Monday.
Oh, my goodness.
So apparently she's not putting out her plans to Steve Santani or anyone else for security reasons, but somehow it's making across the wires that potentially she will be back in the U.S. on Monday.
That's a good update. Okay, there's other news to cover, and Paige Hopkins is live in studio and with the latest. Hi, Paige.
Hi, Allison. Good morning, everybody. Iraqi police say a car bomb exploded near the U.S. consulate in Kirkuk. Police say 2 Iraqis were killed there, 7 more wounded. No Americans were hurt in that attack. This is the 7th bomb to go off this month in Kirkuk. Federal investigators looking into the cause of a plane crash that killed 6 skydivers in Missouri. 2 other passengers were aboard. They were injured. Witnesses say the twin-engine plane hit a telephone pole shortly after takeoff before crashing just feet from a house. Wildfires continue to ravage parts of the Nebraska Panhandle. Already, some 40,000 acres and 3 homes have been scorched. Firefighters say it could be another 3 weeks before the flames can be put out. And there's word that Reggie Bush has agreed to a 6-year deal with the New Orleans Saints. The Heisman-winning running back skipped the team's first 3 practices, holding out for a better deal. He's expected to report to camp today. A source close to the negotiation says both sides have agreed, but no word yet as to how much Reggie will make. Bush was the 2nd overall draft pick. Now let's get back to Gretchen, Allison, and Kelly.
Thanks so much, Paige. Okay, Greg Talcott was at the scene this morning of those Kana airstrikes. His location is just, he said, what, 8 miles away, something like that?
8 or 9 miles away.
He was able to make it there very quickly after the airstrikes. He has a compelling video from there, and he tells us the story now live. Greg, tell us about what you saw this morning.
Yeah, folks, it's the kind of thing that you don't really like to do on this job, but it's the kind of thing that sometimes you're forced to do. I stood there next to this crushed, destroyed building and watched little child after little child, dead children being pulled out of the rubble, pulled out of the wreckage of this building. Sometimes these kids were so small. There were 2 kids on the same stretcher. Also women, very, very few men, mostly women and children. The figures that we're getting now is as many as 50, 54, 56, 57, those coming from various sources. What happened was at 1 a.m. an Israeli airstrike occurred, just almost point blank at this building. By my reckoning, it was just right next to it, but such a huge impact that it collapsed this building. And also, by my discussions on the ground with the people there, these folks had to struggle to fight for their life, and then many of them did not live for about 4 or 5 hours before rescue teams were able to get to them, because in the nighttime, ambulances, Red Cross, what have you, do not move around. They're so concerned about getting hit by Israeli Air Force. So, in fact, it was a very, very ugly scene. Now, the question is, why were they there? Why had they not evacuated?
Around Kiryat Shimona. This is the hardest this has been hit now. I would say maybe in the past 6 or 7 days, we've had probably a dozen Katyusha rockets rain down in this area over the past several hours, and a lot of that might be in response to the raid conducted by Israeli troops last night on the village of Kila, a Hezbollah village of Kila, which is just across the border in Lebanon. In fact, we profiled that village yesterday. We went up there and did kind of a preview. We had no idea that that was actually the next village they would hit until last night or early morning, I guess. They went in there with a raid, and they really went in there to change the landscape. They brought bulldozers in, explosives, and their whole idea was to go in quickly, change the landscape, get rid of any kind of maybe Hezbollah hideouts, and then come out. And we're going to go back and show that today. But I believe that a lot of the Katyusha rockets coming in now in Kiryat Shimona are in response to that raid last night, because, again, this is the heaviest rocketed fire we've been under in the past 7 days. But keep in mind, it's early yet in the day here in Israel. It's about 4:35 in the afternoon, and we've already had some 100 rockets rain down on northern Israel. Nothing any further south than Haifa, but still, all of yesterday they had about 90 rockets. So far today, 100 rockets. We're talking about maybe in response to what happened last night in the village of Kila. Also, of course, the Israeli raid in southern Lebanon that killed, some estimates, upwards of 54 people. So clearly, This has been a stepped-up campaign on the part of Hezbollah. It is still going on both sides. Artillery is going out. Katyusha rockets coming in. The smoke in the hills still burning. A lot of wind today, and that's not going to help the firefighting efforts because when these Katyushas hit, a lot of this terrain very dry. The wind picks it up, and we'll tend to have those brush fires that we saw again and again over the course of the past 10, 11 days. Guys?
Trace, in no way do I want to sound cynical, but it's almost as if we're seeing that we're keeping a scorecard, if you will, on this tactical tit-for-tat. Israel defending itself, attacking. Hezbollah on the attack with these Katyusha rockets. It goes on, it goes on, it goes on. Where do we find an end to it in terms of the diplomatic mission?
I think that's where it ends, Kelly. I mean, I think really what you're looking at is that this thing will end diplomatically. I think now that both sides realize, you know, look, Israel has said they didn't expect Hezbollah to put up as strong a fight, and Hezbollah says they didn't expect Israel to come after them this hard. So I think both sides have kind of acquiesced to a point, and that may be too strong a word, but I think both sides have at least realized that militarily this thing could go on for quite some time. I mean, we're talking about estimates anywhere from 5,000 to 7,000 Hezbollah fighters. Israel says they've killed maybe 200 of those fighters in 18 or 19 days of the campaign. Hezbollah says it's not that many. So you look at the tit-for-tat, as you called it, and I think what you're seeing here is a realization from both sides that Israel can do a tremendous amount of damage to the infrastructure in southern Lebanon, which they have done, and Hezbollah can fire these things in willy-nilly and every once in a while get lucky and do some damage and possibly, cause some casualties. But I think diplomatically is where this thing ends, and I think both sides, even late yesterday, we did the Fox report. It's at 2 o'clock in the morning here, and they were just starting to go into the village of Kila then. And I think at that point in time, Secretary of State Rice had met with Ehud Olmert. And at that time, I think all sides were really looking at a quick diplomatic end to this thing. Get an agreement, get it in front of the UN on Monday, get it voted on, and get some multinational troops in here as fast as possible. Well, the bomb today, or the airstrike today in southern Lebanon may have changed that game entirely, and it kind of slowed the diplomatic track down. Some are saying it could cause an escalation. Others are saying it could actually produce a quicker end result, that we could see an end to this thing sooner than later. We're just going to have to wait and see what happens, guys.
All right, Trace Gallagher live for us in Kiryat Shimona, where the rocket fire continues day after day. We are watching some fields there smoldering, as we have seen for so many days. I mean, this is a repeat of the scene that's been played out there, and luckily, most people have cleared out of that region. It's been deserted for the most part there, yet Hezbollah just keeps firing the rockets there, so we'll keep monitoring that. Thank you, Trace.
And in just a little bit over an hour, an emergency meeting at the United Nations here in New York City. The Prime Minister of Lebanon asked for an emergency session. That now apparently will be happening. UN Secretary General Kofi Annan announcing that at 11 a.m. they will be taking up this issue. They were going to talk about it tomorrow anyway, but now they're going to talk about it today on Sunday.
And we, of course, will be following those developments as they take place, particularly more on the latest developments as they break involving the diplomacy end of things, which, of course, have to bring this to a conclusion.
Okay, more Fox and Friends Weekend. We'll be right back.
TD Ameritrade's apex traders are among the best in the business, but they aren't always who you might expect. Most people stay with the obvious, like a stock that's in the news. I focus on a specific sector. I explore it. I know it. To me, that's what trading's all about. I have quality research, great tools, technology that keeps me on top of things. So when I see something I like, I can jump on it.
The new TD Ameritrade, where you'll find powerful trading tools like our exclusive market motion detector, a new way to see how fast a stock's price is changing and the volume of those trades.
Use your noodle. Ask questions. Don't follow the crowd.
Get free trades for 45 days and $500 cash and $9.99 online stock trades. Call 877-TD Ameritrade.
Independence is the spirit that drives America's most successful investors.
Call, click, or stop by today.
Thanks for calling Dell. What can we build for you?
Well, my family needs a new computer.
Great. Let's get started. What do you think you'll be using it for the most?
My kids are really into games, and I do a little video editing,
I I'd set you up with a high-performance graphics card, and you might want a faster processor.
Yeah, you know, that's probably a good idea.
Okay, now let's talk about a monitor.
I was thinking about a 20-inch. But wait, let's step it up to the widescreen.
You got it. All right, you're all set. We'll send it right out.
Great, thanks.
At Dell, we don't build technology for just anyone. We build it for only one. You. Dell. Purely you. Enjoy your music, games, and photos with a Dimension E510 desktop powered by an...
As we're required to do, according to the Israeli censors, so we don't give away the topography here and the geography. And you can see for yourself the smoldering remains here of one of the rocket attacks that struck. This struck about 3 hours ago, and it was a very significant blast. I think the single loudest Katyusha rocket blast that I have heard. There's already some discussion that it was a much more powerful Katyusha, and it did a great deal more damage, at least to this undeveloped area, in that there was an enormous brush fire here, the likes of which we have not seen, caused by these Katyushas. So it is very possible now, at least according to one IDF spokesman, that they are using a more powerful type of weapon. And another thing to be mindful of today, during the past 24 hours, there have been repeated incursions across the border by the Israelis. Israel, we're covering our camera one more time again as I go back on camera. Israel has been sending troops directly across the border into a number of Lebanese villages. Those troops are taking with them tanks and APCs, and these, we are told, are brief incursions. They last just a few days. The goal here, to mop up what's left of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, but as the Prime Minister underscored today, he knows the clock is ticking. They're mindful that there's going to be a ceasefire, but they say their goal, first and foremost, is to get rid of Hezbollah. Back to you.
All right, David Lee Miller, thank you for that important breaking news that you just gave us. Very interesting. 10 to 2 weeks, Israel is saying that it needs to finish its offensive. That's the first time that we've heard actual numbers.
That's coming from the Prime Minister himself, Ehud Olmert, trying to get the job done. And of course, the question is, will we give them the time to do it?
Yeah, because now the UN's going to be meeting today in about an hour, and the meetings will continue throughout the week, with Secretary Rice coming then to the UN and giving her proposal.
All right, we've got to take a break. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, we do.
We've got to take a break right now, and we will have more Fox and Friends Weekend very soon. Stick around. 2 minutes.